It is so important to me that we understand our Africa from the root cause. So as if Berlin Conference was not enough, when the colonizers were leaving the continent between 1958 and 1961, France did something that was just downright terrible. Made the African leaders sign what they call the pact for the continuation of colonization. France made the Francophone countries sign the pact for the continuation of colonization. Allow me to highlight a few of the items in the pact for the continuation of colonization. And I urge all of you to Google it and read it. And if that does not disgust you, I don't know what will. First, the French said, well, you see, we built a few schools, a few roads, a few hospitals, taught you about the fork and knife and sitting on a table and eating with utensils. We're going to call that the colonial debt. And for that, you shall pay to perpetuity. In addition, you will deposit 85% of your bank reserves with the Minister of Finance, the French Minister of Finance. Collectively, the Minister of Finance, the French Minister of Finance will take all your deposits. It was 85% back then. It's now down to about 60. The French minister will invest that money in the French Stock Exchange under the French name. You may or may not know the returns. Today, France is taking out of Africa, Francophone Africa, over $500 billion. Over $500 billion. We, the Africans, the poor countries, we are giving France over $500 billion a year in, year out. And no one is talking about it. The latest figures are saying for every $14 billion that France takes out of Africa, by the time they finish investing it, they're realizing upwards of $300 billion for every $14 billion. So in actuality, France is taking out of Africa trillions of dollars year in, year out.
Hello, family. Welcome to African Esquire TV, and I'm your host, Tierney Cherie. If you have not heard yet, there has been a lot of backlash against the African Union because they have fired the ambassador to the United States from the African Union, Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao. And if you are someone who has paid attention to African liberation, if you are someone who has paid attention to the African diaspora, connecting Pan-Africanism, any of these subjects, you've probably seen this woman online speaking for Pan-Africanism, speaking against the separation of African people on the continent from people in the diaspora. And in particular, you probably heard her advocating for the year of return, meaning the year of 2019 when Africans in the diaspora would go back to Africa and reestablish connections with Africa, being our mother continent. Now, I have not seen a leader as vocal as her for the African Union. As far as I've seen her everywhere online, honestly. I've not seen an African leader as has gained as much notoriety and respect from the diaspora the way this woman has. So it's not like she's not been doing her job adequately. In fact, I think that she's gone beyond what probably any envoys from the United Nations, from the African Union, and actually reestablishing connections. You've seen her at HBCUs, you've seen her all over the country in different meetings trying to advocate for the African diaspora. Now, what you also have seen her doing is speaking out against colonialism, in particular neo-colonialism. And that is where a lot of people are thinking is the reason that she was let go from her position. Now, she recently spoke out against France. And if you don't know anything about France colonialism, you know that every single country in Africa is colonized in some type of way. But the way that France enforces its colonization of the so-called Francophone countries, meaning African countries in France that were colonized by France, it's a lot more explicit, it's a lot more severe, it's a lot more unapologetic in that they have clearly shown that they are willing to go into Africa, take the resources, and do so in such a way that is so explicit. Like the biggest example of this is the colonial tax, where France still has claim, or still claims, right to 85% of the national reserves of African countries that formerly were colonized by France. That's 85% of the money that should be given to those countries that those countries have raised. That's going to France. This is one of the conditions of the colonial tax. There's so many conditions of the colonial tax. France exercises control of the military exercises of former of their former colonies. They exercise so much power over their former colonies that it's kind of embarrassing that we have this happening today, and not a lot of people talk about it. A lot of people pretend that France is just this liberal country that, is a human rights advocate for all people, and they allow the French president to speak inside of their conferences and allow the French president to have free reign of Africa and all these things, and completely ignore the fact that he is pushing, not just him, but the French presidents and the French country in general has been pushing the colonization of Africa in such a way that is so blunt. It's not even being hidden. Now, she spoke out against this recently, and a lot of people are making a connection that this is probably the reason why she was let go. And you think about it, it's okay to be an African Union person, African Union leader, and have Pan-Africanist views in the sense that it's okay for you to call for African unity. It's okay for you to say that we all have to come together. It's okay for you to say that, hey, the diaspora, we need to connect. But whenever you start speaking against those outside influences on the African continent, whenever you start speaking out against the United States, France, England, and speaking out against the exploitative relationship that the West has with Africa, that's when you'll see the dynamics flip. And that's what's happening in this case, because we've seen, a lot of people recently talking about Africans in the diaspora uniting with Africans on the continent, but you don't really hear them speaking out against the exploitation of Africa by the West. Now, this is not surprising to me, frankly, to be honest. Whenever I found out this woman was from the African Union, I was surprised because the African Union, of course, is controlled by African countries, and just about every single African country, you can argue every single African country, honestly, but it's being colonized. Every single African country has some type of relationship with the West or with China that is exploitative of their people, of their natural resources, that they are allowing their countries to be stripped of the things that are their rights, just for money, just for those leaders to have the favor of the Western governments. So when you think about that and think about the fact that these are the people who run the African Union, well, of course, if you have someone who's an actual Pan-Africanist, someone who's actually speaking about breaking the exploitative relationship between Africa and the West in that position, the obvious thing is that she's not going to last long, because she's actually speaking against their interests, in that these are the people who are getting paid by the West to allow them to exploit Africa, and yet you have this woman who is speaking out against that same relationship. So I was surprised that she was from the African Union to begin with. And I'm certainly not surprised that she's been fired. We have to understand that the African Union is a white supremacist organization. It's a white supremacist organization the same way that you go throughout the world, throughout the diaspora, and you go to countries where African people are being exploited and with institutional racism, and we can look at those institutions and say that is a racist institution and a white supremacist institution. It's the same thing. And we might get confused about that because we see black faces running the African Union, but who's funding the African Union? Because it's not African countries that are funding the African Union. The African Union is being funded by outside people who are trying to get their influence done. The same way things are done politically, like say in the United States, where you have an election happening and you have different donors, different corporations who are giving money to a candidate in order to make sure that their agenda or that their wishes get on the candidate's agenda once they get in the office, and they're sending money and all these things. That's the same thing that happens to the African Union. They're speaking to the African people about unity, but really they're getting donations from people who are saying, hey, make sure you deal with this. Hey, make sure you give us access to this. Hey, make sure you do that. And that's what's running the African Union. Now, to understand why it's the white supremacist organization, it's not just the fact that these outside donors are establishing their interest in the African Union, but you also have to understand the history of the African Union. So let's go to talk about the history just a little bit. A lot of people, we kind of assume that the African Union was just started by Kwame Nkrumah, and of course Kwame Nkrumah was the Pan-Africanist, like the first president of an independent African country, and really kind of like the father of Pan-Africanism on the African continent, because he was the first one to actually see success as far as decolonizing Ghana. Of course, he was eventually put out of power by conspiracy by the United States and other Western powers, but he was the father of Pan-Africanism, and he was very vocal about Pan-Africanism. Now, what a lot of people do not realize is that the African Union, which was previously the Organization of African Unity, it was divided into two camps, the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group. So the Casablanca group, those were African countries that were Pan-Africanist, meaning they did not just want the African Union or the Organization of African Unity to be a collective of Black or African organizations that were going to gather and discuss issues or gather for solidarity or blah, 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 blah. They wanted a complete federated African continent, meaning they wanted a United States of Africa. A United States of Africa, it was believed, would prevent neo-colonialism, meaning the West from coming into Africa and being able to get the resources of Africa, being able to get the economic opportunities of Africa, because they were basically making deals with African puppet countries. So to them, the only solution to this was a complete United Africa. Now, the Monrovia group was actually supported by the West. These were countries like Liberia, Nigeria, Senegal, Cameroon, really a lot of the former Francophone countries. It's not a coincidence. A lot of these countries fall under the Monrovia group. And this group, they did not want a federated African continent. Instead, what they wanted was there to be different nationalist countries, meaning the different African countries would have their nationalist fights, but they would not have a united Pan-Africanist fight. They would not be a united Pan-Africanist government. And to them, this would allow, them to stay in the good graces of the West. Now, not surprisingly, the Monrovia group ended up winning out over the Casablanca group when it came to the creation of the Organization of African Unity. And that the organization was not a federated African government. Instead, it was just a gathering of different African governments with different African agendas. And ultimately, a lot of the Casablanca group basically were put out of power or were assassinated. A lot of the people who were speaking from a more from a more united Africa stance were basically done away with by the West, because obviously those people were a threat to the Western dominance of the African continent. It's also important to note that the Casablanca group was a socialist group, and they were calling for the resources of Africa to be shared with and owned by all African people instead of being controlled by individuals. And that would have been a direct threat to the West. That would have been a direct threat to colonialism, because if you have the African people all owning their resources, not just some person in government owning the resources, not just some billionaire owning the resources, but all the African people having a claim to those resources, then you can't have the West come in and say, hey, we're going to come and take your gold, we're going to come and take your ivory, we're going to come and do this, we're going to come and do that. No, they would have to actually go through the proper channels to get access to those natural resources that they were so accustomed to having so freely. So it's clear that there was going to be an actual issue. If the Casablanca group would have prevailed, this probably would have caused World War III, honestly. Now, go to today, many years later, and what we have unfortunately, like I said, the Casablanca group, a lot of those people were basically put out of power. So that Pan-Africanist United Africa voice was basically done away with. Now, we have people like Julius Malema, who is now trying to bring that back. But of course, Julius Malema, he's not even the president of South Africa. He's a president of the EFF, but we don't have national voices calling for this. We don't have national voices calling for United Africa. And a big problem with that is that you have instead countries that are calling for their own independent states, despite the fact that these countries that were formed from colonialism, they are colonial creations. Like, these are not borders that were drawn by the African people. These were not decisions that were made by Africans. These were decisions that were made by the West, and they're being continued by African people because there's no willingness from the government officials to actually change the dynamics of the colonial relationship. They're just fine with it. Now, obviously, when you go to today, you know, we're living inside of a colonized Africa. And it's important to understand that the African continent is not going to change from the top to down to the bottom. It's going to change from the bottom up, meaning it's going to take people, it's going to take organizing, it's going to take organizations to challenge the authority of bodies like the African Union. And this is why I keep saying we have to get organized, because really, you know, we should have always understood the African Union has been very complicit when it comes to not only issues of colonialism and neocolonialism, but it's also been complicit a lot to the racism done by the West. It's been complicit to the racism done to countries like Haiti, to countries in the Caribbean. It's just been very complicit with the things that are happening, and yet they've been very silent when it comes to the Western exploitation of their own resources. So it's been a body that is not going to be a voice for our people, and so we have to stop looking at these types of bodies as being some type of saving grace for us, because they're not. They're not designed to be. Again, this is a white supremacist organization. Despite the fact that these are black faces that were put into power with Western interest in mind. So these cannot be people who are going to advocate for African people. So what I think we have to do with the African Union and with different bodies of white supremacist organizations that are they're acting as though they represent African people, although they do not, is that we have to start organizing ourselves into organizations that are going to make that claim to power. Because ultimately, if we're looking for these government authorities to liberate us, these governments that are put into power by the West to liberate us, then that's just going to be an ongoing fight, because the fact is they're not going to act inside of a way that's going to benefit the people. And anytime that they do act in that type of way, that's when you have a lot of assassinations, that's when you have sanctions, that's when you have an issue like what happened in Zimbabwe. I mean, imagine if Malema actually does gain power in South Africa, and I believe he will someday become president of South Africa. Imagine if he not just becomes president, but has a majority inside of the parliament, and he's actually able to bring about land expropriation without compensation. And imagine what that's going to do with the Western interest towards South Africa. That's going to completely turn South Africa from being such an ally of the United States to being one of the most hated countries on the African continent, because they're doing the unspeakable. They're taking back what's theirs, and we're not supposed to African people take back what's ours. We're only supposed to take what little crumbs these people are willing to give us after the fact, and even as they continue exploiting us, we're only allowed to take what crumbs that they continue to give us. So let's just understand that we're not dealing with a body in the African Union that's here to represent African people. We're not dealing with a body that cares about African people. We're dealing with a body that's here to maintain the status quo. And unfortunately, our sister has been taken out of the position that she was in, but we have to do what we can to make sure that we stand behind her and make sure that, hey, even though she's not going to be inside of the African Union, Dr. Chihombori-Quao, even though she won't be in the African Union as a representative, we have to make sure that we give her some type of other way to advocate, because what she has been saying, what she has been speaking has been truth. And we have to make sure that we have alternative organizations to the African Union in order to continue the dialogue of African liberation. So that's all I have on this. Are you guys surprised on what happened with this sister? Or really a mother, really, an African mother? Are we surprised what happened? I mean, I was expecting something. I was very surprised that they were allowing this woman to speak out the way that she was already speaking out. But are you guys surprised? And what do you think is the ultimate solution to these types of situations? Is the African Union anything to be messed with at this point, or should we, wake up and see what time it is? The same way that a lot of us has woken up in the United States to see what time it is with like the Democratic Party. Should we be waking up to see what time it is with the African Union? I did a video previously where I said we have to wake up to see what time it is with the United Nations. So clearly we don't have any type of form of true redress. And so what do we do about that? I will be reading you guys' comments, and guys, I will see you in another video.